Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me? Okay, cool. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our first ever DataPoint 2015. We're really excited to have all of you guys here. My name's Michael. I'm the founder of the Data Incubator, and we're really excited to have you at our first ever DataPoint conference. So as you know, DataPoint is a community celebration. It's organized completely by the community, completely by data scientists. And it's organized totally for the data science community. We have about 200 people here in the Google building and about 550 people watching online on our simulcast. So we're really excited about the turnout. A little bit about myself. I'm the founder of the Data Incubator. We train the top 2% of PhDs to become data scientists. In fact, some of the organizers here are actually alums of our program. And I'd like to just move on, actually, and thank our sponsors, the people who make this event possible. So that would be Google for hosting us and giving us this wonderful space, as well as Chartbeat, AppNexus, and YouNow for providing the lunch, breakfast, and after party. And I hope we all stay around for that. I also know that we'll be providing some free swag throughout the day. So for those of you who are actually able to make it to the New York location, I hope you'll be able to stay around for later in the day when we'll be handing out free swag from our sponsors. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't thank our fellow organizers. I am just a figurehead. I show up, I give fancy remarks. But the people who actually made all this possible are Jayron, Yash, Isaiah, Nir, and Sam. I know they've been working very, very hard on this for the last 3 or 4 months now to put this wonderful program together for you. So I just wanted to thank them. And if you guys see them, by the way, throughout the course of the day, give them a pat on the back because they really deserve it. And now, without further ado, I'm going to let Minerva Tontokos come and speak. She is the CTO for New York City.
Hi, good morning. How is everybody?
Good.
Come on. How is everyone? All right, all right. And I'm fine. Thank you for asking. Boy. So as Michael mentioned, and I won't re-thank everyone, consider yourself re-thanked for this wonderful event. I'm really excited to be here at the first ever DataPoint 2015. Being the first ever CTO of New York City, I like firsts a lot. It's one of my things. I was asked today to talk to you a little bit about what some of the city initiatives around open data. But first, I'll just give you a very quick background. I've been in technology for 30 years. My first company I started when I was a junior in college in 1985. And it was an artificial intelligence company. And really, it was pretty much the forefront of AI 30 years ago, and in many ways, big data. Back then, AI was structured around the concept of a knowledge base, which is what we call a rules engine today, a database, which is what we call a database today, and an inference engine, which is really the very early days of pattern recognition. In our case, we were using it for management consulting, the interpretation and creation of formulas on the fly in order to interpret financial data from companies. And it became one of the early decision support systems. So I can kind of say I was sort of a data scientist since then. I think that counts, right? But I do mostly identify as an AI person. I spent the next 30 years in technology and the last 17 as a chief technology officer in the private sector. And in fact, this CTO job is my first ever public sector job. I joined recently after being the CTO for UBS Bank, and prior to that at Merrill Lynch, where we re-platformed the data warehouse for the investment bank globally. So I'm familiar with some of the issues around data. And we in the city recognize the value of using data to make decisions. And so we've got several initiatives around that. One, of course, is how many people are aware of the New York City's open data portal? Oh, great, great, super. We are committed to providing transparent, free, and accessible data to the public. It's our effort to create new opportunities for New Yorkers. Today's, the city's open data portal is the largest in the country. We have 1,350 data sets, but that's not how we measure our success. How we measure our success is in its usability to you and the citizens of New York to make the lives of everyday New Yorkers better. What we like to say is, what problem are you trying to solve, right? Whenever you're going into a big data set, that's the most important question. What problem are you trying to solve? And for us in New York City, we would love data scientists like yourselves to think about some of the toughest urban problems using the best and latest advanced technology to solve the toughest urban problems: income inequality, homelessness, tech equity, gender divides in technology. Those are the kinds of problem sets that we hope that you can use our data to solve. Big apps. So big apps related to open data. It's now in its 6th year. How many folks here know about big apps? Yeah, okay, you get a gold star there. You raised your hand both times. Huh? You won last year. Congratulations. So it's an awesome thing, right? And in fact, there's still a couple weeks left. The deadline is October 14th. And this year, what we did was a much more focused set of challenges. So there are actually 4 challenges you can apply to. One of them is sponsored by my office, the Mayor's Office of Technology and Innovation, called Connected Cities. But there are other great challenges there. And it's part of our effort also to harness the technology and the great minds like those of yours in this room to have very targeted impact on New York itself. So we created these challenges in partnership with agencies looking to solve problems. So so the applicability of your solution will be part of the criteria, and in fact will actually help the city in a huge way because we've targeted it that way. So since 2009, it's now in its 6th year. So if you go to bigapps.nyc is the link. Finally, I want to mention just a recent initiative in the administration that I'm especially proud of, because one of the biggest challenges facing New York City is we need more talent like you guys. Companies who come here want to hire engineers. The city government wants to hire data scientists. And so one of the initiatives we announced just 2 weeks ago is called CS for All, Computer Science for All. This is a groundbreaking shift. We have committed that every single New York City public school kid, 1.1 million of them, will get the opportunity to study computer science by the year, within 10 years. So it's an $81 million program. Over the next 10 years, we're changing curriculum, we're training teachers, and we're getting equipment. And what's really unique about that is that it's a partnership between the city government and private funders. So the city government's going to invest money, and private funders are going to match that money so that we can all give every single kid in New York City public school system a chance to get exposed to technology, to follow their path into this great, great career. So it's a truly groundbreaking thing, and we think that that will grow a lot more data scientists like you in the future. In closing, I just want to wish everyone a really, really successful day here. Later today at 5 o'clock, there's a panel with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Amin Mashariki. He is the Chief Data Analytics Officer of New York. He runs our data analytics team, and he'll be on a panel at 5 o'clock. Unfortunately, I won't be here at that time, but please do stay, and you'll learn a lot from Dr. Mashariki. And he's also on the panel with my good friend Catherine from App Nexus. So I'm very envious that you'll be able to hear those two talk later today. So again, thank you very much. I know you're going to rock this. Thanks so much. Have a fantastic DataPoint 2015.
So before I introduce our next speaker, who is our keynote speaker, I wanted to say if you want to tweet about us, you can tweet at DataPoint NYC. So our next keynote speaker is Slav Petrov. He's a researcher at Google's New York office. His team works on syntactic parsing and its application in machine translation, information extraction, and question answering. He also teaches a class, a statistical NLP class at New York University, if you're interested. Please give him an applause.
Okay, let's see whether this goes smoothly. Okay, cool. That was easy. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Google. So I'm happy to kind of give the first talk. To kind of get a sense for the audience, though, I wanted to get a show of hands, kind of who considers themselves data scientists? Everybody, hopefully. I guess I'm not sure where to draw the line, but like, who does machine learning? A bunch of people too. And then applications to language, so natural language processing. Fewer. OK, that's what I assumed. At the same time, I work on NLP, and that's what I know. So I'll talk mostly about machine learning and data science applied to language, with a focus on what we can do with large amounts of data and whether data is going to be enough and we can just do unsupervised learning, or how much supervision we can get and or need. And so my premise will be that we will need some human input, and just raw data might not be enough. But before we start, Minerva did a nice introduction, actually. I like to kind of contrast how reality looks and what Hollywood tells us is possible. And so in the 80s, we had already computers or robots that could talk and understand us. But the reality was a little grimmer. People were writing rules and were trying to encode the human knowledge in rule-based systems. And those were brittle. Computational power wasn't quite there. And there was the AI winter where lots of people got disappointed. Then in the 90s, we had self-driving cars that could talk in the movies. But in reality, like personal computers were starting to appear. Statistical approaches were starting up. And so I think those are sort of predecessors to what we currently do. But the problem was that we didn't have enough data. And we didn't have enough compute power to actually build applications that kind of could be ubiquitous the way they are today. And so then in the 2000s, computers had feelings, and then people got scared that the artificial intelligence is going to take over. But in reality, we started to find ourselves using artificial intelligence, machine learning in our day-to-day lives more and more. So Google Translate, I assume most of you have used. Speech recognition. Try it out if you haven't tried it recently. The quality has gotten really a lot better over the last year or so. Error rates have been cut by more than 30%. And even for me as a non-native speaker, my phone tends to recognize what I say. And I can do maybe short dictations, or just simple question answering works remarkably well. And I'll show some examples of that towards the end of the talk. And we now also have self-driving cars to some extent. I think the technology is pretty much there. It's on the regulators to figure out how to put these cars on the street in a safe way, and to figure out the legal framework. And you've also heard about kind of Google Brain, machine learning at large scale applied to lots of places. So I was going to look now at some examples in NLP, and we can see sort of where the state of the art is, what can we do, and what is missing. So if I give you this article, recent news about Volkswagen. I grew up in Germany. You've probably heard about them cheating. And I wanted to see what the French people think about it. And so I went to Le Monde. I know it's a French newspaper, but I don't speak French that well. So if I look at Google Translate, I can actually make sense of this, and it sounds quite fluent. So the scandal of Volkswagen shock, a little this one, but then shockwave continues to spread. Friday night, the Swiss authorities have announced to suspend the sale of new diesel models of the group, potentially equipped with motors rigged and able to distort the emission tests. Not bad, right? So one could think that machine translation is basically solved if one looked at these two examples. But we'll see shortly that that's not the case. Before that, I wanted to take a detour, though. How many of you know what's happening behind the scene and how these systems are trained? Very few. Cool. So I can teach you something. And we'll do it with a simple anecdote, but it should get you give you an understanding of what's happening behind the scenes. So if I ask you to translate between these two made-up languages, Centauri and Arcturus, and there's the sequence of characters. I've been nice and put white space to separate the words for you, and ask you, can you translate this for me? Well, it's a made-up language. Nobody speaks it, so no, you can't. But if I give you a parallel corpus, so sentences that are translations of each other, and you can use that to translate now and kind of use it as a puzzle to figure out what's going on. How would you do it? Well, you would probably look at the first word, Farok, and try to find it in the text. And so it happens to appear twice in the text. And if we look at the translation, there's only one word that appears in both translations, and it's this word jad. So we can't be completely sure that that's the right translation, but it's quite likely. And so we can go through, and then we can look at the next word, Sirach. Well, we're unlucky here because it appears once, and so any of the words on the other side could be the translation. We could maybe say it's going to be in a similar position, maybe it's the third word again, but who knows? So let's continue and see whether we can eliminate the possibilities by aligning the other words. And so if we look at Hihok, we actually see that Arad is the word that appears always with it. So that seems to be the translation. And so if we keep going like this, we can align all the words and get probabilities or correlation statistics of how words might translate to the other language. It's not going to be perfect, but it will give us a signal. And so that's the basic idea that has been around since the 80s for how to do statistical machine translation, late 80s, early 90s, I should say, and is the foundation of modern statistical systems. And so it involves not just these correlations the way I described them, but the YAM algorithm, if you're familiar with it, and people have done many extensions, but that's basically what we do. And so once we have these alignments, we can extract the dictionary of words or phrases and how they translate. And then we can put together the translation. In this case, we actually, by elimination, figured out that Sirach doesn't align to any word and should be dropped, because sometimes words just don't get translated, articles or something like that. Now, the question is this a grammatical translation? Do we need to change the word order or not? And that's something that we'll get back to. But before we get there, I'll just show you sort of the power of data. Depending on how much training data we have, how many example sentences we have, we can measure the quality of the final translation system. And so, I'm missing the legend. But there are 4 different languages here. Portuguese, French, German, and Chinese being translated into English. And on the y-axis, we have the translation quality measured by an automated metric, and then the amount of training data we have. And so if we start with 1 million sentence pairs, we get these scores. When we go to 10 million sentence pairs, everything gets better. With 100 million sentence pairs, things get even better. And with 1,000 or billion sentence pairs, things get even better. And so the plot is a little misleading. You're looking at this linear slope, but it's logarithmic on the x-axis. So it's a factor of 10 increase of the data. Nonetheless, you might say, well, if we keep kind of increasing the data by a factor of 10, maybe we'll get to human-level translation. And some people believe that. I'm a little skeptical that just more data is going to cut it, because languages are not just kind of random sequences of words, and there's a lot of subtlety, and there's a lot of structure in it. And so we should try to take advantage of it. And so to show you that kind of just a lot of data is not going to cut it, here is an example for a Japanese translation. And again, I tried to find something about Volkswagen. So I was able to identify an article, but sorry, I actually don't know what this means at all, because I can't even read the characters. And so if I pipe it through Google Translate, we get the following translation. Germany Volkswagen of VW emission regulators in the wrong issues surrounding the company South Korean corporation is September 30th, Beetle Golf, such as 28 models, meter about 12 million units of passenger car recall. So like, you always, like, you start reading and it sounds reasonable, and then it just changes completely. And then you get into the next phrase and it looks reasonable, and then it's again shuffled completely. And the problem is that the Japanese word order is so different from the English one that if we just do small local reorderings on the word order, we're not going to get the fluent translation out of it. No matter how much data we have, I don't think we can learn to automatically reorder this. And as a kind of just high-level example, in English, you typically have the subject and the verb and then the object. In Japanese, it's subject, object, verb. And so we need to identify the verb and move it into the right position, because if it's at the end but needs to be at the beginning, it's going to be very hard otherwise to get the grammatical sentence. And without knowing what verbs are, we can't do it. So this system actually already uses some syntax, but obviously there's lots of work for us to do. And so the way that we do it in kind of at a high level is that we take a sentence, and in addition to figuring out what are the words, once we translate them, we need to put them in the right order. And so I'm showing a German example here because we speak German. And if you wanted to take the sentence, she can eat pasta every day, in German, you would take the verb and move it to the end, similar to the Japanese case. And now we can translate this reordered sentence, and the grammar on the German side will come out better. So you might say, well, we can write a rule that's pretty simple. Just take the verb and move it to the end. Once you have analyzed the syntactic structure, this grammar of the input sentence, you can do that. Well, language is fairly flexible and has always exceptions to the rules and exceptions to the exceptions. So if you make the sentence be, she believes that she can eat pasta every day, well, now you need to take not just the eat verb and move it to the end. You also need to take the modal can and move it with it to the end, but then flip their order. And so all these patterns, like, we need to learn automatically, but I think we need to sort of get familiar with the data. Just, it's not going to jump out at us. Like, we need to understand the phenomena. We need to learn about the problem, bring in some linguistics to it, as well as machine learning, and lots of data to observe these patterns, because we cannot dream them up. And then we can hopefully make some progress on this problem. So how do we do this? Well, as I said, we use syntax, because if we just try to find a random permutation of the input sentence, that can be reduced to a traveling salesman problem, which is NP hard, and you don't want to do that. that's hard. So we need to limit ourselves to what the possible permutations are, which are allowed, and then score those and figure it out. And we have done a bunch of work in this area. So switching gears now, if we kind of, assuming we can analyze what are sort of the nouns and verbs and the grammatical structure of the sentence, what about more semantic things, like understanding entities and their types? So Bourdain reviewed Alinea carefully last year. We can figure out that, oh, Anthony Bourdain is actually a person. He has a Wikipedia page. Freebase is a knowledge base where things are grounded. And we can link up Bourdain to that. Note there, Alinea, or Linea, I don't know how to pronounce it, is a location. It's actually a restaurant. And we can figure that out. There's some ambiguity because the same string of a name can apply to multiple places or entities, but we can figure it out relatively reliably if it's a well-known entity. Furthermore, we can take the pronoun he and, based on the context, figure out that it's probably referring to Bourdain because Bourdain is a person, while Alinea is a location, and therefore we wouldn't want to make it co-referential. We would say there or here to refer to that. And so one thing that we want to do beyond the common entities is, though, to analyze rare entities. And so here's a snippet from a newspaper text. And we can identify that there's this entity, Andrew Burnham, and we don't know necessarily what it is, but probably we can guess that Andrew Burnham and David Kinch are names of people because we have seen Andrew and David as names. But Bywater, well, I don't know what it is, Big and Easy Manresa. So detecting the boundaries of these mentions is not like super hard. We have capitalization and other cues that help us. But then figuring out the types is actually something that's quite difficult because there's just lots of names and it's hard to know what they are. And so this would be the labeling. To produce that, we use, again, large amounts of unlabeled data with a small amount of labeled data to try to bootstrap our way out of this problem. And so what we do is we take a bunch of text and from news and the web and analyze it with our system. It's called SAFT. And so given this analysis, we can then extract the boundaries for the mentions and build a graph based on contextual similarity. So we can see that David Kinch appears in similar contexts as Daniel Patterson and Thomas Keller. And these edges on this graph will have weights that correspond to how similar the contexts are where things appear. We'll prune unlikely edges so that it's not a fully connected graph. And then if we have some human supervision, for example, for common entities like Thomas Keller, we can label them with the correct label. And then we can run graph label propagation to smear the label distributions over neighboring nodes, because the assumption is that entities that appear in similar contexts will have similar types. And so instead of having to go through and label all entities out there in the world, we can just get some seed entities that we can label reliably and then use semi-supervised learning to extend this information to other entities. So that was an animation that I forgot. All right. So as I said, figuring out what the entities are is non-trivial, but relatively easy. Like, there's not that many ways to refer to Mona Lisa or Leonardo da Vinci. And so I just assumed that this can be done. One thing that we're working on now that's a little harder, but I think is going to be needed for certain applications of language understanding, is to try to understand how people refer to the relations between these entities. So if we have a knowledge base, like a knowledge graph, the way Google talks about it, Freebase, or whatever representation you want to have, you need to come up with a schema and describe how the entities relate to each other, given fixed relations. But natural language has many ways of referring to the same thing. And so figuring out how people describe the relations between these different entities is quite difficult. So as an example here, a couple questions that all should give you the same answer. Which university did Obama attend? Which university did Obama go to? Which university did Obama study at? Which university is Obama's alma mater? And so on and so forth. And currently, Google handles several of them, but not all of them. And the problem is that there's just an infinite number almost of ways to express this. And so we are pursuing some approaches to try to learn how to do this grounding by looking at entities and the relations that are between them, how they're expressed, and then doing some linguistics, some machine learning, some data munging, and then trying to learn ways that things can be expressed so that if you, in the future, come and ask a question like, which university did Obama and his wife attend? We can figure out several things. We can figure out that his wife refers to Obama, and his wife is Michelle Obama, so we can ground the two entities. And then university and attend is the educational institution relation, and then there's this conjunction and, so we want to find the intersection of the universities that I attended and return you the one correct answer, which is Harvard Law School in this case. And so this is not launched yet, but we're working in this direction. What is launched, on the other hand, and I encourage you all to try it out, is just to talk to your phone and ask questions the way you would ask your friends. So who is the chef at the French Laundry? It's a restaurant in California, quite tasty one. And one thing that will happen in the background that you won't see is that we'll do this analysis from a linguistic point of view and figure out, OK, there's the chef is a noun, and additionally, we also know that the French Laundry is an entity of type location. So in this particular setting, this will be just kind of analyzed. It won't necessarily affect the results because the result is fairly clear. It's Thomas Keller. And so you'll get the result. But then what we'll do is we'll actually remember that Thomas Keller is now in the context of your session. And so if you ask, as well as the French Laundry, and so when you ask what are its hours, something that few people do nowadays because you might not expect this to work, but it does actually work, and it's been working for a year, is you can get the answer because we will analyze it and we'll figure out, oh, there's this pronoun, it's. What can it refer to? Well, nothing in the local context can be grounded to it. But if we look at the previous query in the session, we know that there are these two entities, the person Thomas Keller and the location French Laundry. And so given that it's a neutral pronoun, it probably refers to the location. And therefore, we can retrieve the correct answer, 5:30 to 9:15. If we ask what books has he written, on the other hand, we know that he, again, must be referring to something in the context. But it's unlikely that he's the French Laundry. It's more likely that it's Thomas Keller. And so we'll get you the correct answer, which is the list of books that Thomas Keller has written. And so using context and pronouns is something that you should periodically try because we're experimenting and launching new features all the time in the space. It works for spoken queries, both on the phone as well as on your desktop, if you want to speak to your desktop. So to leave some time for questions, I think data is very important, and it's a big building block when trying to build systems. But we need to think about how we can bootstrap our way out of it by using data to build systems that can analyze data that can then be used for further training the systems. And then something that I didn't talk much about, but is also very important, is then to work with the user and harvest user interactions. When you search on Google and you click on the third result, we can learn from that that the first two are not so good. And so similarly, in many settings, when you have a machine learned system that users are interacting with, we need to harvest the user interaction as a signal that can produce additional auxiliary data that we can use to train better systems and thereby try to get closer to understanding the world and building something like artificial intelligence, whatever that may be. So thank you. Any questions? Yes, please. It's hard to see from here because I have the lights on me.
I didn't think I needed this, but okay. What do you think will happen with SEO and SEM given conversational search?
That's something that I personally don't tend to worry about too much. I want to provide users the right answer, and that's for sort of these fact-seeking queries. That's definitely the right thing to do. If you're searching for products, that's an interesting question. But currently, we're thinking primarily about factoid questions or just general questions that are not sort of product-seeking. And there, I think giving users the right answer is the main focus. And there's enough other queries that will make sure that my salary can still be paid. Just speak because I really don't see anything.
I'll wait for the mic so people online can hear too. But so there's things like Duolingo that are available for that allow for translation by people as a part of their language training. How have you been exploring leveraging that kind of technology as a way to provide additional data to be able to have additional translations of sentences?
So I guess there's Duolingo. There's a friend has a company called Unbabel where they're trying to use human computation for improving translations and crowdsourcing them. I'm not sort of a core member of the Translate team to comment on it. I can tell you sort of that we're trying to harvest signals from suggesting better translations. And there you might have seen over the years, people have tried different things, from just allowing people to edit the translation to being able to select between multiple translations to drop-down menus with alternatives. And all of these things, they're experiments to figure out how to best harvest the data. Because if you just give people a free form where they can edit stuff, it's too noisy. Sometimes it's just so far away from what the current system is predicting, or it's just spammy. And figuring out how to kind of separate signal and noise is really hard. And so putting some constraints is important. I think the other thing is figuring out how to most people will get the translation and copy paste it into some other place and edit it there. And figuring out how to actually learn from that, I think is a very interesting and challenging sort of infrastructure human-computer interaction problem. But I don't think we have a final solution. And overall, yeah, I think as long as you can get the incentives aligned so that users solve the task that they're trying to solve and as a byproduct produce data that's useful, we can have a win-win. Duolingo has that premise, but it has gotten fairly quiet around them. I don't know sort of what's going on. I think people are very excited, and then at the end it's tedious to learn a new language, and so people give up. Other questions? Yeah.
So, how do you know what's the right scale where to stop this process? Because you notice that the word by word doesn't work, so you kind of expand to sentences. But sometimes in languages, that's not going to be enough, right? You're going to maybe need a couple sentences to make sort of another sentence out of a couple. What's the right cut point?
So the question for those online is that. What's the right unit? I showed that words are not enough and focus on phrases and sentences, but maybe you need to go to paragraphs or some larger unit to provide a meaningful translation. And it's we've done experiments, and most of the information is typically contained in a sentence. In some cases, for pronouns, for example, it might be ambiguous given the context because in one language, you might not distinguish between different genders of the pronoun, but when you translate it, you need to predict the correct gender, and that might not be available in the current sentence. You need to look back. And so some of the examples that I showed about coreference resolution, we have some experiments that we want to do in the space to see whether we can improve it and also make it more consistent between formal and informal pronouns and things like that. But sort of to be able to translate Shakespeare, we will need to look at more than just a sentence. But for most practical purposes, sentences seem like a reasonable unit to operate at for both computational reasons and sort of getting the gist of it. But yeah, for perfect translation, we might need more context. All right, we have another minute.
So I know there's a lot of made-up languages from linguists that are supposed to be very easy for anyone to learn. What are kind of the challenges for creating translations to these made-up languages and then going from the made-up languages to any other language?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one could try that. One could try to just kind of create the ultimate interlingua language, which would be some type of semantic representation plus. The challenge is oftentimes that what I showed, kind of data. If you don't have enough data, even if the language is simpler, you're not going to be able to translate well into it. And if you compare the kind of translation quality between different language pairs, sometimes you'll see that even for closely related languages, if for political reasons, for example, there's just not that much text in both languages, the translation system is actually worse than for some languages that are further apart. And so translating into these made-up languages where we basically have no data is going to be very hard. And at the end of the day, like, even if it's a simpler language, there's a lot of information that needs to be represented, and languages are so complicated because there's lots of nuances. So we'll lose some nuances, I think, if we try to come up with some generic intermediate representation. But that's my take. All right, I think we're out of time, so I'll be around the coffee break and happy to chat more. So who's the next speaker, or who's going to be introducing him?
I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Jairon. The next speaker is Peter Behrman. He's a highly esteemed social science professor at Columbia University. He's well known for his research in adolescent health and social network and application of network methods for understanding narratives. He's widely credited for bringing network analysis techniques to the population and demographic research communities. He's also the author of Dorman, a book published in 2005, an ethnographic study of Dorman in New York City. Let's give him an applause.
Thanks. Maybe you are going to give me a clicker. That's it, cool. So I guess I've learned not to follow Slav Petrov at conferences. So when the organizers invited me, I thought, well, the main goal of their main goal must have been to let's see, how do I click to my slides? Oh, I see, I'm doing it. Okay. I'm already evidencing the statement I'm going to make, but the main goal was to raise the mean age of this group to about 26. So I thought I can do that just being myself. And then I looked at the other speakers and the topics, and I thought, I wonder if I have anything actually that's interesting to this community. And I thought, well, okay, I'll try. So that's the goal anyway, is to race through a couple of very different projects that count as related to data science for me, and hope maybe that they trigger some thoughts for you. And the two projects, the first I'm going to talk about, joint with Alix Roule, Jean-Philippe Cointet, and myself, is on political thought in the United States. And the second project is on the autism epidemic. And actually, they have absolutely nothing in common, except that you might say they're both about substantively important things, that is, things that people care about. And they also have the unfortunate fact that I'm involved in both of them. So that's the linkage that I'm going to try to connect. So let me start then with this first project, the goal of which is to try to understand if we can identify the morphology and the content of what might be distinctly modern political thought in the United States, and somehow distinguish that morphology and content from what might have been a traditional political discourse that preceded it. And so by morphology, let me say, and by way of analogy, that if I were to say to you, once upon a time, a young girl set out to make her fortune and blah, 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 you'd immediately recognize that the story, starting once upon a time, was a fairy tale, which is a specific kind of genre whose morphology, and we know this from the work of Vladimir Propp, is characterized by 29 operators that are largely sequential, and they operate on objects. The objects in fairy tales might be ghosts or witches or ogres or frogs and so on. But whatever the things that are operated on are largely transposable. So it doesn't matter for our understanding that it's a fairy tale when we hear once upon a time a small girl set out to make her fortune. It doesn't exactly matter if it's a witch or a frog that the child encounters and overcomes as the story unfolds. We recognize that as a fairy tale. And it's in that sense that I want to identify a morphology or a structure for modern political thought. And also, in addition, I do want to try to get some purchase on content. That is, I want to know what it is also that political discourse is about practically. So that's the goal, is to identify morphology and content. And to do that, to do something like that for using text analysis anyway, that has an implication for the kinds of data structures that we have to use. And the implication might be the following, which is, first, the data structures have to span the history of the United States. That is over 200 years. And the provenance of those data structures has to be the same over those 200 years. Otherwise, if we have multiple different kinds of provenance, then we can't actually figure out where the change is coming from. And thirdly, if we're interested in something important like political structure, then the data structures that we use have to arise from a substantively important context or institution. So it may be that a lot of different kinds of data structures satisfy those three requirements. They're not actually trivial, but the data structure that I'll use for now is the annual State of the Union, which is an address that's given by presidents every year, actually is given every year but once, and which shape and are shaped by public opinion, and which drive and are driven by the political issues and framings of their time. So the first thing that one encounters when one works with text that's not kind of like the last 2 weeks of Twitter, but text that spans a long period of time, the first thing one encounters is the obvious fact that the meaning of a word is completely conditional on its position in a network of words to which it's tied. That is, word meaning's not fixed, but arises from the population of words that it's linked to. And in this slide, I'm going to show you what happens when you just look at the word Constitution. And it seems like it's unlikely you can actually see what's there, so I'll assert that at different moments in time over the State of the Union address, the word Constitution is embedded in completely different networks of words. At one moment, it refers to the law. At another moment, it refers to people, and so on. And so because words change their meaning over time, and their meaning is conditioned by their position in a network of other words, the usual strategies of defining words, which work perfectly for temporally bounded short texts, but the usual strategy for defining words on the basis of dictionaries that have only a modern or completely ahistorical standpoint, or actually on the basis of some kind of assignment probabilistically to topics, as in topic modelings, won't be successful. And that instead we have to think of a way to capture directly the network underpinnings of meaning, which is what we're due here. So that's the kind of key conceptual move. And then just to recap, the data structure, our State of the Union speeches, the goal is to understand morphology and to try to figure out if we can learn something about context. So the first thing one can say about the State of the Union speeches is that they're a continuous form. So this is just a simple bag of words approach. And you can see in this graph moving from year to year that the variation in the words that are used in the State of Union address are completely minimal. And yet, from the darkness and the lightness of the graph, you can also identify clear periods, the first partition of which that separates kind of modern and traditional discourse is 1917, which isn't to say that the 1917 address has actually anything unusual in it at all. It doesn't. It's to say that after 1917, in the speeches of 1918, 1929, 1945, 1978, and so on, we can see, standing in 2015, that those speeches come to be more similar to the one in 1917. That is, the future of the text that we're analyzing is what activates the text in 1917 as distinctly on the spline between modernity and tradition. So weirdly, those speeches are continuous whether or not presidents or parties change. Actually, you might have known that already. Like, it doesn't matter if there's a Republican and then a Democrat, and year to year has absolutely no effect on the kind of bag of words approach. Okay, so now you know that. What does the structure look like statically? So what can we generate a semantic mapping of all the speeches in order to directly, that is, visually investigate the inner structure of each cluster of terms as well as their relationship to each other? So on this slide, you can see the process that we're engaged in, and then the graphic on the right-hand side of the slide shows you a kind of frozen static image of the State of the Union speeches over 200 years, pooled. They're frozen into a single mapping. And that mapping consists of conversations about things that we recognize. That is, foreign policy, domestic policy, statecraft, production, the Navy, the frontier, land, and so on. And those things also appear as kind of dominant discursive elements at different moments of time. So you could think of these clusters or conversations as the frogs and witches of fairy tales. That is, they're the things that make up the contents of the speeches on which the morphological structure operates. So I mentioned at the start that in Propp's treatment of fairy tales, the morphological structure is a series of operators. Let's say that those operators are things like forking and splitting and so on. Actually, I skipped this slide. This just shows you kind of the distribution of topics over time. But let's say that these operators are things like forking and splitting over time. And here we can observe an actual tangible process in our data structures as well. For example, the splitting of a single discourse into two, although conjoined, slightly disjoint discourses at another time. So we can observe in the nature of the cluster of words and topics over time as they move from one period to another, kind of a splitting structure there. And we can imagine, actually, ideally, all the various ways in which conversations, that is, clusters of words that convey some kind of conjoined meaning, that are tied through such operators. We can imagine all the ways that those conversations are tied at one time to the next time period. And so in the language that I've used so far, we can imagine how clusters of densely tied words flow over time, how they merge with new clusters, how they fork into multiple clusters, how they remain continuous with the prior cluster, and so on, producing something analogous to a river network in which the meanings of words flow over time, that is, over the course of history, which in the end is something we can induce, a river network mapping of the State of the Union addresses that captures the continuities of the form and the discontinuities of political discourse, marking those periods and conceptual realms in which change occurs and those in which continuity is the main story. So this gives you a kind of mapping of the structure of the various conversations in the State of the Union over time. And you could imagine doing this in lots of ways. You could just imagine running a moving window across the speeches and essentially just kind of keep taking snapshots and watching conversations change. Or you could imagine doing it in a slightly more static framework, which is pooling different temporal moments and allowing them to overlap to capture static images. So that's the kind of idea here, is that we can actually uncover the morphological processes and the contents of a large body of text. And then just to show you that we can do something more conventional with data like this, we can also look at people and look at things like heat maps for presidents and see that, yes, presidents do talk about different things if they come from different times. So this graph will just show you the conversation topics on the same static semantic mapping. There's a kind of heat map underlying it where you can see who talks about what. And you can see that Washington, Lincoln, and Reagan actually do talk about different things because they come from different periods. But maybe also something you knew already, presidents like George Bush and Obama actually talk about precisely the same thing in the same way because they arise from the same period, which is, of course, the demand of discourse. So in the end, I'll leave you with what we started with, which is an interesting finding that standing in 2015, we can discover that modernity with respect to political discourse started in 1917. Okay, I'm going to talk for 3 more minutes about another project, which is the autism epidemic. And it's a little more traditional, so I can run through it more quickly. Imagine you have some kind of space like that. That happens to be the state of California. And what we did is we captured the births of every child in California off their birth certificates. So this is standard administrative data, and you can see where children are born. And you can see, for example, there's this whole swath of California out there on the right-hand side where no children are born, and that's because there are no adults there. And you get data on those children. And then what we can do is do a large-scale administrative data linkage project and link that to every child ever born in California who's subsequently diagnosed with autism, and that's in the red. And those are children born indexed in red. And you can see also that they're not born where no adults are. In fact, they're born where people are born, which is logical. And we can then populate using a whole bunch of other different kinds of data structures. So this is very standard data science, I think. We can populate those spatial regions with anything we want. Here we're going to populate it, or at least sign it with property values, but we can add to that pretty much any kind of variable we're interested in, including all of the various things that are surrounding people in those areas, like malls, parks, pediatricians, roads, elementary schools, advocacy organizations, smog, et cetera, et cetera. And when we have something like that, we then have a data structure that looks like a full data structure in which we've located every child in a physical space, and we've located every child with autism in the same physical space. And we can discover this really fascinating fact, which is that if a child is born and happens to live within 250 meters of a child who's been previously diagnosed with autism, the probability that they'll be diagnosed with autism in the next year is much, much higher than if they're born in an area where there is nobody with a diagnosis of autism near them. And you get the same effect. You get an opposite effect if they live near a child with mental retardation, so that there's no effect of living near a child with mental retardation. And through a lot of statistical techniques and strategies, which I can't actually take the time to show you, I can tell you that this is not the product of selection. That actually what's really happening, and what we can demonstrate through this work, is that people actually do something quite remarkable with respect to this community, I think, which is that they actually talk about things that are important, like their children's development, to actual real people. They learn from those conversations how to interpret development and how to navigate a complex bureaucracy, and they do that all without using the internet or Google. That is, actual personal conversations influence behavior. And there's a bunch of other slides that support that. I want to leave time for questions, so let me say This work is supported by the NIH, and we're very grateful for that. And I'm super grateful that you've been such a kind audience. So thanks. Anything. So if there's any questions. Yeah, I see a hand over there. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it that people who live near close to autistic children know more about autism, or you think there is an underlying some pollution which causes the?
I'm absolutely certain that there's no characteristic of the immediate environment in which they live in that's causing autism, other than the twin process of learning how to understand the developmental dynamics in the language of autism, which is something that's exchanged interpersonally, and then even equally critically, learning how to navigate a complex bureaucratic machinery that provides autism services, which is also something that's communicated. If there's an environmental driver of autism, it's in the previous generation, and you can't find it in the local space where children live now or are born. Okay.
My question's pretty simple. Is the diagnosis of autism constant over time?
No. The question was, I don't need to repeat the question. No. No. Conveniently, in California, they don't provide services to children who are diagnosed with now what would be autism spectrum disorders, so Asperger's. So over this period in time from 1986 to 2011, it is fixed there. And so that gives us a baseline from which to work. But there's, but of course, what's really happening is that there's a different slotting mechanism, so that the children who wouldn't have been diagnosed with autism in a previous generation are now diagnosed with autism, because there's a shifting stigma associated with the relationship between autism and mental retardation.
What typifies the pre-modern and modern political discourse?
Yeah, I was afraid someone was going to ask the content question. So there's some morphological, there's some interesting things about the, so very briefly, and this is a PNAS paper which you can look at and actually kind of see the specific linguistic components of what would be characteristic of modern versus pre-modern discourse. But it's really about a different attitude towards governance, and then there's a different attitude towards what we regard as foreign policy. So these two things stand hand in hand. And then there's a structural feature which is really interesting about modern discourse, which is that its rate of change is much more rapid. And so you can actually kind of recover the rapidity of the rate of change, and that's one of the signals of modern discourse in the 11 seconds I had to answer that question.
I'll just ask the question. How stable you think is your result in the political discourse with respect to the metric you chose for choosing for computing those graphs?
Yeah, so the underlying structure is because there was a question about sentences and paragraphs. The underlying structure arises from co-occurrence in paragraphs, and so you have to ask yourself, is that the relevant unit for something like the State of the Union? And Slav had mentioned, like we do Shakespeare, obviously the relevant unit has to be sonnets, and if we use the Bible, we might, if we're trying to uncover the morphology of the Bible, we would have a different structure. So with respect to paragraphs, I think this is completely robust. That is, it's robust across the set of different noun phrases that we put in. Whether that's actually the substantive organization is hard to tell, and it's complicated because although there's no signal of the changing. I'd asserted the provenance is the same. The provenance is the same, but the modality of deliverance changes. It changes from written form to it's initially oral. Jefferson thinks it's an imperial gesture, so he stops presenting it orally. Then it's in written form, then it's on TV. There's no signal of the change in terms of delivery that we can pick up with respect to the timing of these major partitions. but that change of delivery might actually have an effect on what the underlying structure really should be. Was that a fair answer? According to that, we're out of time.
Right. So perfect.
Thanks a lot.
So much for the
Yeah.
wonderful talk today. Hey guys, I'm Yash, and I'm one of the organizers. We now, if you look at your program guide, we now have a coffee break, and it's great to see a full house and so many people on live stream. Thanks so much for coming. Our idea was that this event will be a great avenue for like-minded peers to interact. So we have purposely kept our coffee break and lunch break a little lengthier. So just make sure that you make the most of it. And we'll reconvene for talks at 11. The next round of lightning talks starts at 11:10. So please try to come in by 11. And when you come in next, try to occupy all the seats because some people are standing at the back of the room. And please help yourself to coffee, and you can spread yourself out in the adjoining space to the auditorium, but please make sure you don't wander too much into Google Space. Thank you so much for being here.
There are lots of seats up in the front, so don't be shy. My name is Nir Jungster. I'm one of the DataPoint organizers. Thank you all so much for being here. Just wanted to give you a quick glance at what the rest of our schedule for today looks like. We have some great speakers to come this morning. We'll have lunch in about an hour and a half. And then we will have some great speakers again in the afternoon with a panel discussion as well on municipal data. And finally, we have a happy hour that we hope you all can stay for. And that is going to start at about 5:40, which is what we project as the end time for all of the speakers and the panel. So right now, actually, we're going to have a series of lightning talks, 5 minutes each. Our first speaker is Mimi Onuoha, and her talk is on Pathways, the Art of Small Data. Mimi is from the Data and Society Research Institute.
Hey everyone, my name is Mimi. I am an artist and researcher working with people and with data. And I realize that at this conference saying that I work with people and data is probably the most unremarkable way to distinguish myself. But I actually mean something really specific when I say that, which is that I work with people and I work with their data. I use code to flesh and tease out patterns in data, but the data that I'm working with comes from people who I interact with in person. So I spend too much of my time sitting in front of a laptop, but I also spend a lot of time actually sitting and talking with people. So I'm going to further illustrate this by talking about a recent project that I worked on. It was called Pathways. It was for National Geographic, and it consisted of gathering a month's worth of mobile data from people and then visualizing that so that I could try to see the stories within that data. To do this, I recruited groups of people who would be willing to give me their personal information. I worked with 4 groups. I took 1 month, like I said, a month's worth of their data, and it was all location and message metadata. And I just want to stress that all of them willingly opted into this. I was funded by a Fulbright grant, so that's a State Department grant. So I was in London, and once in a while, people would be like, oh, so you're an American, funded by the State Department, here, collecting our data. And it was true, but they all opted into it willingly, and all of their identities were protected as much as they could be, and anonymized. So I said I worked with 4 groups. The 4 groups that I focused on were a group of coworkers, a family, some roommates, and a couple. And I collected all of their data, and eventually I visualized that data online on National Geographic's website. And the end result looked something like this. And what these are maps of people's data. They animate and they play out over the course of a month. And there's additional contextual information that tells you the experience for them and for me. All of these maps are online. They're at nationalgeographic.com/pathways. They're actually live right now. And on that website, you can find out more about it. But I want to tell you just more of what that experience was like. So I was collecting quantitative data, GPS logs, when messages were sent and received, like I said, message metadata. And looking with that quantitative data, I could figure out some pretty interesting things. So this was a group of coworkers. They were friends and coworkers. It was 3 of them. And just by gathering their data for a month, I could see that 2 of them, the pink and the orange one, in case you're interested, spent more time with each other than they did with the third. That's something I could see just by looking at their data. But it wasn't until I actually brought that information to them and presented it to them that I could learn why that was, which is that 2 of them were single and 1 of them was in a relationship. I also could see the limits of data really clearly. This was another group of 3 that I worked with, and they were a group of 3 roommates. I wanted to see what the data of a goodbye would look like. And so I collected a month's worth of their data in the 30 days before one of them was moving out of the country. I was there for the goodbye, and it was heart-wrenching. It was really painful watching them have to say goodbye to each other. But in the visualization, that goodbye is as simple as 1 dot just moving off the map. So what I could see was that the quantitative data did not come close to approaching the lived experience of what that was like. I saw examples like this over and over again in the project. The data that I was collecting from their mobile phones, these devices that they carried around with them every day, was quite interesting, but it was not near complete or sufficient. It was only when I elaborated that data with this qualitative information that was layered on top of it, that came from talking to them, that all of a sudden I got something that was much more rich. It was something that was more of a story, more of a narrative. It was something worth looking at. And this, I think, is the strength of working with people and working with data. It is impossible for you to believe this myth that data is this objective thing that just exists in the world. When you work with people, you actually see that this data is no longer disembodied, and you see it for the cultural and human production that it absolutely is. There's also just something really powerful about being able to take people's data, do something with it, and then present it back to them and talk to them about it. It changes the data itself. You begin to look at it differently, but you also look at the people differently. And they become much more than these dots on maps or lines on visualizations. You begin to see that people do have this vested interest in the data that they're generating. I'm no longer working on that project. I'm back in New York, and I'm a fellow at the Data and Society Research Institute. And now I'm tackling a different project, which is about this difficult space of trying to create usable data sets around hard to quantify forms, hard to quantify experiences like discrimination and harassment. But I'll be doing that by actually working with the people who are affected by those experiences. And I'm really excited to be doing that work because it does approach some of the things that I was doing when I was in London, working on pathways, but it also deals with questions that I didn't really have the time to get into, which like about social structures and how data works within those sort of contexts. Yeah, I'm here in New York working on that. If anybody's interested, please get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Mimi. Up next, we have Carlos Petricioli from Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, and also from the Data Science for Social Good. His talk is entitled Mexico from Space. Carlos.
Thank you, Nur. Hi, I'm Carlos Petricioli. I'm going to talk to you about my project. It's called Mexico from Space. Here you can see a very long title. I'm trying to keep it short. So it's how to obtain, process, and calibrate a time series of night-light satellite images to estimate the economic growth of the Mexican federal entities. I'm Carlos Petricioli from Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, and I'm also a data science for social goods. I'm a fellow. So what's a night-light satellite image? Here you can see a night-light satellite image that corresponds to Mexico City, to Mexico. Here you can see like that maybe you're not familiar with Mexico's geography, but you can clearly see that in the center, there's much more illumination than in the north and maybe the southern east part. And that actually corresponds to the states that have higher GDP and higher development. The idea is to use that information that can be obtained from the satellite images so that I can create a model from where I can reduce the error bias that GDP information has. So why should we use satellite images? Well, they represent an objective and systematic way to measure the world. So, I mean, public decisions and private decisions are made daily based on other variables that tend to have much error. These other variables come from different countries, different organizations, different time periods, and they tend to have different qualities in their measurements. So the idea is to take the night lights and use them as a new variable, since they represent a good measurement and it's comparable worldwide, and they actually have a very high resolution. Each pixel in the image represents as less as 0.8 square kilometers. So it's good enough for me. Then why should we focus on economic growth? Well, the idea is that GDP is often badly measured, especially in developing countries. And when you focus on developing countries, much of the economic activity is not actually happening within the formal sector, so it's really hard to measure that. And there's also a problem that the government infrastructure in those countries, it's very weak, and it's even weaker when you focus on a subnational level. So I think it's a good idea to use the lights. So what I did was first, all the work can be divided in three parts. The first part was a calibration process. This time series consists of years corresponding since 1993 to 2013, but in between there were years that where there was more than one satellite. So the data from the first satellite and the second satellite it's not as clearly as comparable. So I had to do some calibration so that it can be really comparable. And there's also, I mean, each satellite has a useful life. So as time goes by, the sensor of the satellites go down, and I mean, I have to consider that also in the calibration process. So after this calibration, I'm able to compare all the time series, and with this, I have around 260 billion pixels just for Mexico. So I think that's enough data, and it's very useful. After that, I estimated a proxy variable using the night lights to estimate the state's GDP, so that I can actually have an insight of how well the night lights predict GDP. And using this proxy variable and combining it with the official data from the government, I estimate what I call a true GDP for the states. And actually, the results are very surprising. It shows that the states in Mexico underestimate and overestimate the long-term economic growth as much as 15%. That means that, for example, here, the federal district is actually underestimating the true GDP as much as 15%. There's also Chiapas, where there's an overestimation of 12%. This represents, therefore, a viable way so that the government can reduce the error in their data, so that they can have a more accurate way of measuring GDP. So I mean, it's a good thing. So thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Up next, we have Joe Studholm from Princeton Integrative RX Analytics, and his talk is entitled A CompStat Approach for the Opioid Epidemic. Joe? Oh, there you are.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Pleased to come here from the orange bubble, which is Princeton, to the multicolored bubble, which is Google. And my talk today is about some data that we've uncovered, which we think has very interesting policy ramifications. I want to tell you how we got it, what it is and where it comes from, why it matters, and run through a little preliminary analysis of it. So the story here starts like this. We somewhat by accident came across an unusual and rich source of data, hidden treasure, I would call it, that's never really been used in the way that we want to use it. Now, like Professor Jones, we had some difficulty extracting it, and we brought it back to our dusty offices in Princeton, where now we're trying to figure out what it means, what to do with it, and what the government can make use of it for. So since we're at Google, the treasure is not, in fact, a golden idol or an Ark of the Covenant. I'm told they already have one of those. So it is, in fact, data. And this is the data that we're talking about. It's de-identified prescription drug management program data. Those are prescription records of scheduled drugs. It's a little-known fact, but all of the states, except Missouri, track every prescription for scheduled medication in their states at the point where it is dispensed. So what you get, if you look at this, is what you'd expect in a prescription drug database. You have the drug, you have the doctor who prescribed it, you have the patient, you have the pharmacy, you have the dosage, you have the dates, you have all that data. And when I say you have all that data, I really mean you have all that data, because what's uniquely valuable about this is because of the way that the data is collected, you have it from every single healthcare provider in a state. You have a very complete record of all the scheduled medications that every single patient in that state has received. And that's very unusual. It's unusual in the US healthcare system to have a complete record of anything about a patient. It's very balkanized, it's very siloed. So we went out and got this stuff. It was hard. There were lots of people shooting arrows at us. There were pits to fall into. And extracting data from state authorities, as you may know, is not always easy. One of them decided that the most secure way to send it was not actually over that very dangerous internet, but instead to put it on a data stick, put it in the mail, and then misdirect it to us. So when I say it was hard to get to, I mean it. But now that we have it, we realize that we have an extraordinarily valuable set of data about prescription records in the US. We mixed it up and did what you would do, which is normalize it, clean it, integrate it with other data sets to get to find out what we can learn from this aggregate data. Now, this data comes from the pharmacies, and traditionally it's mainly used by law enforcement. It was used to build cases against bad actors with prescription drugs, particularly opioids. But inadvertently, in gathering this data for law enforcement, the states have created a very valuable repository of healthcare data that's very useful in the aggregate for policymakers. And I'll give you a short example of what I mean by that. But first, what's the problem we're really trying to solve? Why does it matter? And as an outsider to the healthcare system, I'd built and sold a financial services software company, and I'm now doing this to expiate my sins. We have an enormous problem in this country, and it's the biggest public health crisis in the US, and it involves scheduled medications, opioid drugs, lots of deaths, lots of pain, lots of money. The deaths are staggering. More people die from these overdoses than are killed in car accidents every year in America. And as you can see from this graph, it tracks very closely with the sales of the drugs. They've been much more heavily prescribed, they've been much more heavily sold, and lots more people are dying from them. And for every death, there's addiction, there's undertreatment, there's emergency room visits, and this is all very costly. It's a large part of the cost of the US healthcare systems, and it's been declared an epidemic by the CDC, by Obama. It's a huge problem, and it's being dealt with so far at the state level. So how can this data help? What can you really do with this? Well, the 50 states have addressed this problem in 50 different ways. The states are often called laboratories for healthcare policy or for other policies. This is a perfect example of that. But what is needed is to track the effects of this data, of these policies, using the data to see what's effective and what isn't. That's often referred to as a comp stat approach, right? Where you have some policies and then you have actionable data to see what's working and what isn't, so you can direct your resources efficiently and you can tune your regulations and your policy. So in the aggregate, this data can help do that if it's brought to the attention of the policymakers who so far have not really gotten a chance to use it. So very quickly, I'll run through some of the research that we've done. We did a very broad but very shallow pass through all this with our small team in Princeton. And I'll do the very fast lightning round of what we learned. So in Kansas, you can see that over the time period we're talking about, the average cost of unit of pain relief was high compared to the other states, and it went up dramatically during the course of this epidemic. Why is that? We don't know, but it's an interesting result. In Arizona, you can see from this data, you can actually track to see which pharmaceutical companies were benefiting and which weren't from the policies that were put in place. Very interesting, again, not generally accessible data. You can look at the patterns of pharmacy visits. You can see which parishes in Louisiana have higher opioid users. You can correlate food stamp use and opioid use in a state like Texas, in Maine. We were looking at the locations and the changes over time of high dosage opiate users, looking at the overlaps between benzodiazepines and opiates, which is a bad thing. That seems to have grown in the period we're looking at. Cluster analysis shows the difference between prescribing patterns for primary care physicians and specialists. And really, we've just scratched the surface of this research. So we're out there, we're looking for research partners, and we're really looking to bring this to the attention of people like our keynote speaker, the CTO of New York City, because we think they can really make a difference. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe. And I just wanted to say that although we don't have Q&A for these lightning talks, obviously welcome everyone to discuss with our speakers during lunch or afterwards. As we can hear from Joe, it's a really interesting data set, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions. So our next speaker is Jessica Ford, and Jessica will be speaking about data microscopes, Bayesian non-parametric models in Python. Jessica.
Hi, my name is Jessica Ford, and I'm here to talk to you about Bayesian non-parametrics. So I'm sure many of you have done clustering before, and so as you know, a lot of these algorithms require you to know the number of clusters in advance. So obviously the question is, if you don't actually know the number of clusters, how do we pick this number, often known as k? So often we might do something like we might just assume a certain value of k, say, okay, it's probably 3 or 4, or we might use grid search to say we know it's in between a number of, say, 3 and 10, and say, okay, let's just look through these and see how it compares across different metrics. But ideally, what we really want to do is learn the number of clusters from the data. So what we want to do then is to say that the number of clusters should represent the data, have an appropriate level of complexity, and be based on prior information. So Bayesian non-parametrics is one way to solve this problem by learning the number of clusters directly from the data. In the case of clustering, Bayesian non-parametrics is Bayesian because these clusters can be characterized by a probability distribution, and we can include prior information about the number of clusters and the characteristics of each cluster. And these clusters then are also then non-parametric because k is learned during the process of learning. For clustering, we use a stochastic process known as the Dirichlet process, which allows k to scale with the size of the data, includes prior information, and has a rich-get-richer property. So if we have new data coming in, the probability of this data being assigned to clusters is largely based on how big these clusters actually are. So Data Microscopes is a library that's available through Conda. And currently we have 3 models, all of which are focusing on algorithms based off the Dirichlet process. We have the Dirichlet process mixture model, which is used for generic clustering. Compared to other libraries, we can actually specify what kind of likelihoods you want. So if you want a gamma-Poisson mixture model or a, beta binomial mixture model, you can actually do that. We also have the hierarchical Dirichlet process, which is a algorithm used for topic modeling if you don't actually know the number of topics in your data. And we also have the infinite relational model, which is a stochastic block model, which, as far as I know, has not been seen in a Python library available through Conda. And this can be used for clustering relational data, such as social networks. We have some real-world examples, such as clustering the MNIST dataset for digit recognition, topic modeling with the Daily Kos, and community detection with the nround email corpus. And if you have any more questions, you can go to our website, which is datamicroscopes.github.io. You can go to our repo, Data Microscopes, to install our library. And if you want to learn more about the Dirichlet process, you can go to github.com/tdhopper, which is a colleague of mine, and he has a bunch of IPython notebooks on the Dirichlet process. Thank you.
Thank you all, to all the lightning speakers. Jessica, Jaron, welcome back to the stage. We have a few more talks before lunch.
Thank you. The next speaker is Jake Hoffman. He's a researcher at Microsoft New York City. His research in computational social science involves applications of machine learning to large-scale social data. He also teaches classes at Columbia University. One was data mining.